Okay, so I wanted to do a follow-up video from the Anova oven, and I want to just talk a little bit about how to use an oven in general. And many of us have been there before, whereby we've gotten to a new place, we see an oven and we have really no idea how to actually work with it. What are the different functions, what are the heating elements like, and ultimately how do you cook with it? And I'm going to address all of that in today's video. The basics of an oven is the fact that there are heating elements through the hot box, and most traditional models would have at least two, one at the top and one at the bottom. Now mine, for example, has one at the top and one at the back. Now some ovens also have a convection setting, which is basically a fan churning in hot air through the cooking process. It's also the same mechanism of how an air fryer works. Now the other thing that every oven will also have at the very least is a function to choose your temperature of choice, either through an analog dial or through an LED panel like this one. Now how the oven actually heats up food is going to be really critical, and depending on the temperature you set and also the format of heating element you choose, what the oven basically does is that it turns on the heating elements and it reaches a threshold of, let's say, plus minus 10 degrees Celsius of the target temperature. So for example, if you've chosen 175 degrees Celsius, the oven will turn on the heating elements and reach beyond 175, maybe to about 180, 185 before it turns itself off, and then when it dips beneath maybe 165, for example, it will turn itself back on as well. Just an illustration, and obviously from that model you can roughly understand that the closer that margin and how well an oven regulates that margin is the sign of a quality oven at the end of the day. Now some ovens these days also have additional new functions. So for example, this oven specifically has a sous vide tool or a precision temperature control, whereby I can insert a thermometer here into a food item, and once that internal temperature reaches a certain temperature, it will cut itself off and alert me that it's done. There are also certain functions like steam that's available in certain ovens as well. Mine's a humidity controller, and there are some ovens these days that have an inbuilt camera that actually scans and identifies what kind of food is being cooked and automatically cooks it for you to your preferred doneness. So let's go through how to actually practically use an oven and what are the temperature settings you should be aware of. Now, you may have heard different terms when using an oven, so things like baking, roasting, broiling. What exactly are they? And I'll show you what they actually mean. Now, if you just turn on the bottom element, that normally refers to grilling. If you turn on the top element, just the top element alone, that's normally referred as broiling, where you get a crust just on the top superficial layer of foods. And baking and roasting generally refers to both elements turned on. And of course, there's also the additional convection baking these days, which basically means a fan blowing through the entire oven, which is also known as air frying in certain cases as well. Now for most baking appliances, you would generally use a baking function and also a temperature setting of anywhere between 150 to 180, where if you want something a bit more crusty, more dark, you probably go on the higher end, and if you want something like a more uniform texture and cook, like cakes for example, you probably go towards 150, 160 degrees Celsius. Again, recipe differ, but that's generally the range. You will also potentially use a convection function for baking sometimes for desserts. Think things like cream puffs where you need a bit of rice, so that additional air going through makes the rice a bit more apparent as well. Now on the topic of baking, in the case of breads for example, your range of baking varies between 180 degrees Celsius all the way to 250 degrees Celsius. Take sourdough for example, you will use 250 for the initial bake and bring it down to about 180 for the finished cook. You may also use a steam function or a humidity function to add extra lift in the initial baking process and also for a thicker crust. Now on the topic of savory foods for example, when it comes to things like roasted chicken, you would generally use a temperature range of between 170 to 200 degrees Celsius depending on how fast you want it done. Now generally speaking, I roast my chickens at around 180 degrees Celsius for a quick cook of 25 to 30 minutes, and then finish it off at 200 if I want an extra crispy skin. Generally speaking, you would use the convection function or the air fryer function, or you will also use a roasting function. Now personally, I don't use roast for a roast, I will use the convection because it's just faster. More air circulation means more even cooking as well. Now on the topic of savory foods as well, when it comes to foods that you want just a topical or superficial even layer of browning at the top, you can also use the broiler function. Now the broiler function is basically the top heating element, and you probably would want to shift the tray to the higher position to just get it closer to the heating element as well. You will also use this same function for superficial toasting on the top. And obviously on the topic of toasting, if you want an even all-out toasting, you would do the same position but turn on a convection function. Now the one other thing about ovens that you can also use is for slow cooking, whether it's a braise or stew. You can put the entire pot as long as it's heat safe inside this oven, and you could do things as low as 120 to 150 degrees Celsius for 3 to 4 hours. In that kind of context, you can use either the convection function, or you can also use a bake function or a roast function as well, depending on how much heat do you want from which direction. So for example, if I'm making a beef stew and I want the top layer to be browned a little bit, I will remove the lid and I will turn on both elements, and I may even add an air fryer function or a convection function just for added circulation of heat. Now speaking about low temperatures as well, you can also use your oven to cook things like rice and vegetables that you would traditionally boil or cook on the stovetop. For small eaters or small servings, you could just put everything onto a tray and just dash it in. Leave it there for about 45 minutes depending on the cook ratios. So let me just recap very quickly of how to use an oven. It boils down to two simple questions. The first one is basically how fast do you want your food done, and this will ultimately impact not only time but also the temperature that you choose. So for example, if you want a cook that's really fast, generally speaking it's on the higher end of the temperature scale, which is between 180 degrees Celsius and 200 degrees Celsius for example. If you want something low and slow, which is perhaps more than 1 hour long, or maybe you want to just cook rice for example, you probably use closer to boiling temperature, which is between 120 to 150 degrees Celsius. And whether you want that faster or not depends on whether you use convection or not. The other thing that you want to think about is where do you want the heat to come from? Do you want it to surround the entire food, which in case you would use convection? Do you want it just on the top, which will then use the broiling function? Or do you want it to be all direction but a little bit slower, which is where you will use the baking or roasting function with no convection? Now the one function that I don't speak about quite a fair bit, and it's something that most people don't really use, is the grill function, which is just the bottom heating element. Now if I just wanted a bottom heating cook method, I would just use the stove pan, so that's just me, but you do you. Now if you enjoyed this video, do consider leaving a like, and if you'd like to see more videos on how to use an oven to cook certain dishes or air fry certain dishes, do consider letting me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time. Bye.